Sharks, did your season just change? Don't worry, we have some solutions for you. We're going to talk all about the 2024 CrossFit Games season changes.
Starting with the move from top 10% to top 25% into the quarterfinals.
Semifinals being cut from top 60 to top 40.
And the age group and adaptive athletes getting their own CrossFit Games.
And then
we're going to talk about programming.
All right, guys, we're here talking about the new CrossFit Games, or CrossFit in general, their season changes for 2024. And it's actually interesting. Chris posted last Friday, Chris, this was like 3 days ago, right? Yeah, about what people think about the changes. And most people...
It was overwhelmingly positive.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. I'm being serious.
No, really?
Yes, of all, wow. The only one, in probably a couple thousand responses, the only one that was negative was the top 25%, the change from 10% to top 25%. So of the audience that was polled that actually answered this question, 25% said that they liked the change, and then 75% said that they didn't like the change.
Okay, hold on. So we're going to be more inclusive. Why do you not like that? Like, if you're someone, I can see the counter arguments to this, but also if you're someone who's already in the top 10%, say you're top 5%, why do you care if they invite more people? Just a bigger party.
I think that a lot of people initially, and we're already starting to figure our plans out internally, were concerned from an affiliate perspective on how difficult it potentially would be to manage top 25%. I don't know if that's worth worrying about yet, because I don't know how many people in that 10 to 25% window will even sign up for it. But that's all I could really think about. Everything else was positive, all the other changes?
Yeah, so we asked
or like more positive than negative in a vote?
Correct. So like with semifinals, we asked, hey, do you guys like the changes from 60 to 40? And it was 51-49. So it was basically dead even, but still not a huge like 25 to 75 like we saw with the top 25%.
We need more participation from bubble athletes.
That's what I was going to say.
Question.
The population that I think probably doesn't like the 25% rule and doesn't like the cut from 60 to 40 are the bubble athletes, because one, cutting from 60 to 40, if they're a bubble athlete, they were already on the edge and now they're, outside looking in.
Be tight.
And then they're also the people who having, scored dilution from having more people in the field affects them the most. If you're someone who needs home run workouts and then there's people that are, turning in, we'll just say turning in scores that aren't necessarily getting reviewed because, their overall finish was like 2000th, but they have that one or two workouts that finish in the, the top 20. That really affects those people. So that's probably why those are the people who are downvoting that.
Yes.
I mean, go ahead.
I just want to kind of direct the conversation a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to ask is, what do you guys think? And then we'll kind of go around and why. So Kyle, do you like the top 25% or the change from 10 to 25%?
I think if we can include more people, I think it's going to be a net positive in the long run for the sport. The more people we can get participating, the more excitement there is. I also think about, novice athletes who are like, first coming into it or just aging into the open division. Like, it's a good thing for them.
My turn.
Yeah.
I am struggling to find, a really good reason on why I like it. That doesn't mean I don't like it, but it's so ambiguous with why they made the change, and the statement of saying, well, we listen to you guys doesn't like sell me.
It doesn't seem like it lines up with what people were saying.
So I think from a business perspective, I can understand it, because I was talking with Max, and a few years ago I was like, well, why do they limit how many people can do quarterfinals? Because it's like an infinitely scalable model. Like, why would you not just let people do it in general? And then you could have like I understand like, well, we want to make the test more difficult, but you can just have smarter programming around that. So I get that. Maybe they're kind of going back now and being like, well, originally this is what we should have done. From a programming perspective, we don't know what that means. So maybe, to me, it makes sense that maybe it's a move to get more people involved in the initial open by allowing the workouts to be less aggressive and less basically scaring people off. And then they can kind of shift all those higher skill, higher complexity demanding type workouts into quarterfinals, where they can like give people what they want. Because a lot of people will complain, there's no max lift, there's no muscle ups, there's no like really high skill stuff, but now they allow for that by having like a really big quarterfinal weekend. So, and making that 25%, it's a much larger population that can do it. In terms of getting more participation in quarters, I mean, maybe there'll be some increase in revenue, but I don't think it's going to be a massive amount. Just from experience of watching the on-site gym here on United, they had like 12 people qualify from class into quarterfinals, and I think 4 of them did it last year. So I just think like you were saying, that 10 to 25%, it's not that they're not that talented. It's just a commitment level. Like those people just probably don't want to spend a weekend doing all those workouts anyway. So no matter how good they are, they may just not even be interested in doing it.
Yeah. Brannen said last year, 50% of the people that qualified in the top 10%, or about 50%, just signed up. Yeah. So about 5% out of 10. I don't know if it will be much more than 5% of the, or like, I guess that would be 20% of the overall top 25% that sign up. I'm right now, I'm kind of ambiguous about it. I feel like the top 25% just like doesn't change much. I did like I feel like finishing top 10% is a pretty high level of physical development. Like it's a thing that can anchor people who are aspiring to be athletes as a goal. When you go from 10% down to 25%, that means like I could probably not train and get in the top 25% to make quarters. I think that takes away something from like the intermediate competitive CrossFit athlete that I'm not a super fan of, but it's not big enough that I'd like make a stink about it. And I'm kind of just encouraging people like, look, whatever the rules are, we got to play the game. Let's try to be positive about it. We know there's things we're going to disagree with, but the cut to 40 at semifinals, I'm not a big fan of, especially in some of the harder regions. I think those, or whatever sections, semifinals, I think there are some really, really good athletes that are going to be left out. And there were athletes that finished in the top 10 at the games this year that wouldn't have qualified for the semifinal through quarterfinals. And I think that's exposing. Yeli Hosti is somebody that comes to my mind. He finished top 10 at the games and was below 40 in Europe in the quarterfinal to the semifinal.
Yeah.
So that makes me feel like there's definitely going to be some issues with like, you got to make the quarterfinal tests really good, because if you let 25% of people in and you don't have really good reviewing standards on thousands and thousands of people, if somebody has a little weakness, it could potentially keep them out of their career. So there's something in that I'm not a super fan of.
Let's stay on quarterfinals and talk about that, because there are a few problems that people have reached out to me. And one of them you already mentioned. We'll talk about affiliates. And Mike, I want you to touch on that in a minute, because you're helping our affiliate program, or you're writing the affiliate programming. But before we talk about that, the test, does this change? And you kind of alluded to this, Mike. Does this change the way that the Open is programmed? And then how do we need to program quarterfinals to get the correct number of 40, the right 40 into semifinals?
Well, I think you brought up a really good point. It probably should change the way that they're programmed, and whether or not that happens obviously remains to be seen. But I think logically it would make sense to make the Open, especially if you're trying to get, TV's having some problems trying to get, 25% through and make sure that it's accessible to at least the top quarter of the athletes into quarterfinals. The programming is probably going to need to be adjusted in some way to make sure that can happen. And then the semifinal, like Mike talked about, there's ways to program where tests can get during quarterfinal. Thank you.
Sorry.
There's too many of these, intermediate stages here. But I think making the programming so that it's progressive within the workout, where the skills, progress to more complex as they go. I think that's probably what should happen, whether or not it happens.
I'm so curious to see how it looks, because if the goal is to get more people in quarters, but you're making the test harder in quarters to weed out to progress to semis, is that a guarantee that when you release the workouts, you're going to have more people signing up? So are they also considering that? Because like people will just not do it when they see the workouts. Like the quarterfinal workouts from years past, the bottom 10%, people, they just want to do it. They're like, I'm not going to do 150 GHDs. Like,
right. If it's 150 GHDs, or if it's a 275-pound clean and jerk with burpee box jumps like last year, the 50-year-old who also has to do the same workouts because they announced that, and we'll touch on it in a minute, just is going to just not sign up, right? And so to your point, I think that is a bottleneck that they haven't, or maybe they have thought about it, but it seems like they haven't thought that far ahead, and it may limit the signups. And then obviously the participation that's our community.
Yeah. And I thought about what you said. If you said, okay, they're going to simplify the Open tests a lot, and then they're going to put all the complex stuff in the quarterfinals. Originally, my first thought was like, oh, that's a good idea. Then it makes it much more accessible. However, I feel like if you had the Open, let's say from 75th percentile to 25th percentile, so basically the median of all people that compete in CrossFit, had no opportunity to do the advanced stuff in the open. I think that at the affiliate level and them are going to be really pissed off that the tests are so boring and simple relative to what they do on a daily basis in their classes and really enjoy doing. So you might then piss off the masses and then have the same thing with that top 25% where you say, hey, we're going to go into this top 25%, but the workouts now have to escalate so quickly from basic tests that it wouldn't make sense. So
you're saying like someone's worked on ring muscle ups all year to do those in the open. And we've heard these stories all the time, right? Like success story of the first ring muscle up at the end of a workout. And now they're not testing the open. That's going to disappoint someone.
Yeah. So I think that would be a mistake. I mean, I don't know how they're testing. I know that I don't have access to give them my opinion other than this platform if they listen to it, but I don't know, that idea in theory sounds good, but I think in culture that would not fly well with the affiliates.
On the other side, they could still have those in the first 3 weeks. And it just means that if you don't have them, you're not limited to quarterfinals.
Yeah.
Like you'll still be able to get through.
Sure.
So, it could be that side of it as well. Is that why they did it? I don't know. Tell us. Explain it.
Yeah. Although Boz was just on a CrossFit Games podcast talking about it. I wanted to be able to watch it before this podcast.
Well, sorry then. I didn't see
I saw the link.
Sorry, I shouted.
I saw the link last night and I was like, damn, I can't watch this before the podcast. But I'll watch it. And then when this video posts, I'll go into the comments and see if anything you guys said was explained in there or myself.
I mean, going back to what you said too, in terms of like, to me, it's like you're lowering the bar for the fitness, I guess, what you're striving for in regards to fitness a little bit. And that just, to me, was kind of a bummer because it's a setback. Like people have built years and years and like our programs and all right, let me remove our biases because of what we do in our programs, but just in general with people's interest here in classes, it's like, all right, well now what's the goal? Like, because if it's not that difficult to get in I don't know. We'll see. But I don't know what that does to motivation. I like targets. I think that's what CrossFit is. It's like hard and it creates pressure. And I think that's necessary. So, yeah.
I know for me, last year before I got hurt, when I had committed to it, feeling like I could make it into the top 10% of something felt like, oh, I got something to chase. That's a good job. Like you're getting an A on a test. You're in the top 10% of all of the people that sign up to do this. The equivalent of like top 25%, even if there are people that are in the 70th percentile where that is a reach goal, I think more likely than not, those people are not the people that are motivated to try to, like they're taking classes and they're part of the community, but they're not motivated to keep training from a sport perspective. So I feel like pulling it down kills motivation for a lot of the people that do take the sport seriously, that are the people at Wadapalooza and all of these competitions all year round are those top 10%. So I think making that broad, I do think kills a little bit of the like, okay, this is a goal I can shoot for, because the gap from 25th percentile to top 40 in that semifinal is like that's never happening for most people ever. But getting from the 75th percentile and the 90 is like, hey, a couple years of work, fitness, strength, skill, you can do that.
And we've seen that in our
attainable
programs.
goal. Yeah.
After listening to Max articulate that, I think now I'm convinced that it's a negative. You went around the circle and asked what we thought about top 25. And I was like, oh yeah, I think it's a good thing. I think that's a really good point for the people that are, the active participants in the competitive CrossFit community. I think it's going to be a negative for them from a motivation perspective. I think there's something to that.
Well, they'll just, it won't kill their motivation. They'll just not be motivated to participate in their version of the sport. Yeah. So it's like their motivation to participate in CrossFit Games season goes down, and then they set new goals. They're like, I'm going to compete and crash. I'm going to do Wadapalooza. Yeah. So I think that's just a net bad for the sport, because we want the open to be bigger, right? Like that would help.
Mike order. Unless in quarterfinals they announce cuts per day.
Oh man,
and that's your new measuring stick of progress through quarters.
It may be something to do. Yeah. So Mike, I want to go to you, because you are in charge of our affiliate program, and we write for gyms all over the world. One of the, I guess, critiques from affiliates has been, this is going to make it much more challenging if everyone does sign up, because originally I only had 15 people doing it. Now I'm going to have 50 people in my gym and I don't have the space. So what do you say to that?
I think that's with the assumption that they're all going to do it. And like I said, last year there were 12 people that qualified through United, and less than half of them did it. So, I mean, that's just speaking for this gym. I can't say that for all gyms. And it's not a step forward in managing quarterfinals to be an easier weekend. That's for sure. You're basically opening the door for more people. When I don't know anyone who said, hey, like we can handle more in quarterfinals. Everyone complained and was like, stop giving us these crazy equipment setups and logistics. Like we've got to change something here. So I don't know where that came from, but yeah, I mean, I could definitely see for a lot of gyms, it's super frustrating, but something that we're considering here is the weekend of quarterfinals for athletes that qualify. If they want to be serious, pay the money and do it, we're setting that up and allowing them to do it. And then the week after, we're considering creating an in-house competition with the workouts.
Nice.
So for those that maybe aren't necessarily like, look, I don't want to pay the extra money, I don't want to like show up all weekend and do it like that. We're going to do like a Friday night and then Saturday do like 2 or 3 of the workouts and make it like an in-house comp for those that want to do it.
And by the way, I heard you talking about this with your team.
Yeah.
I would encourage most gyms to do that. I think that's really cool because then you're still in the sport. Everyone can still do the workouts and kind of test themselves without having to take it super seriously, especially if you're like 20th percentile and you know you're not going to qualify for semifinals.
But then you're not on the leaderboard.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I think what's the incentive for gyms to have extra people sign up for this? None of that money goes to them.
Dude,
and it's just more work for them that weekend. So here's an opportunity for you to do it yourself, make some shirts, have people interested or get involved, like have the community support a large percent of your gym now that could qualify for it and make a fun event out of it. So there's a way to flip it. And I think we're going to try that and see how it goes.
Yeah. I want to get my complaints out now so that when it comes, I can be all business, but I'm a huge not fan of this. They put the age group and the individual on the same weekend and they expanded the days. But now when you create the condensed field, top 40, I think almost everybody, if you have 6 days to do the workouts, is going to now repeat every single workout or almost every single workout.
You will have to.
So you're going to have, you're like, oh, you're more days, but you're like, well, now you're going to do all the quarterfinal workouts and then everybody's going to come back and do all the quarterfinal workouts again because there's not, unless they have very like tight time restrictions, but tight time restrictions with that many people, then I just don't see how this becomes logistically easy. We're already talking about internally having to stop athletes from coming here.
Yeah.
And like, that hurts my soul because we spend all year helping people train. And then it's like, hey, like we literally cannot logistically manage what they're asking us to manage. So we have to say no because the constraints of what it is make it impossible to create a good community vibe. And we're one of the few like larger camps out there, but I do know there's most people compete in these little competitive hubs.
I mean, there's a lot of competitive gyms with a lot of athletes that will be doing this too. So yeah, it's not just like camps or anything like that.
Yeah. So I'm not a big fan of that. I'll just be honest about that.
Well, we can come back to solutions because I don't want it just to be us saying we're not fans of things. So at the end, if you're listening to this and you kind of hear us giving the negatives, we're going to talk about solutions at the end, but I want to kind of keep moving through. And so now the open is going to be 2 weeks later, which I actually think is a net positive for us as far as
the open. The actual open.
The actual open is 2 weeks later, and then quarters are going to be 3 weeks later than they were last year, which pushes it back, from the open. So you have more time to train, which I think is a net positive. But does that change anything else in your mind?
I mean, from the competitor side, for those that are doing in-person competitions, it's further away from like the Wadapalooza, the Fittest of the Coast. So it actually, I'm happy to see that because I'm like, all right, cool. Like the season starts like just a few weeks later, which still allows people to put focus on some of those in-person comps and then actually like get back into training a little bit. And for us within Compete, like we're basically running an extra cycle now.
Yeah,
so
I think it's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the structure of program and I think mindset changes for individuals. So end of open, I think it's 5 total weeks until they compete again. It's almost the same timeline as Masters was. And then I think I read the first semifinal is somewhere in the middle of May. So that means they're basically going to peak for quarterfinals. And then if they qualify, only have like 2 weeks of ramp up or 3 weeks of ramp up in those early weeks. It's just a little bit different than last year. They had qualified pretty quickly. And then I think we had like 6 to 8 weeks to prep. So I think it means that for athletes, we're going to see more things like running and endurance style workouts and strongman in quarterfinals prep, because if you're going to qualify from quarterfinals to semifinals, it's almost like you had to already be preparing as if you were going to semifinals. So logistically, I think that changes a little bit, but I guess we'll work those details out as we get closer and closer to knowing what's actually happening.
For the bubble level athletes though, that are, looking at the outside of that top 40, they're probably not going to have the luxury of spending time doing the running and things like that. But they now have this chunk of time, this 5 weeks where it can be like truly dedicated quarterfinals prep. And I think for the vast majority of people participating that are, somewhere last year, if they were like 100th to, top 30, that group of people are all going to be competing for those last 10 spots essentially. And they're going to have to use that 5 weeks really well in order to qualify.
That's such a good point. It's the programming, the way that an athlete looks at it and how they prepare or how a coach prepares is going to be different for someone that is a Travis Mayer or someone that's like solidly in the top 40. And then all of those bubble athletes, they can't just prep for semifinals anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. That, and also too, assuming that 6-day window, let's say that there's no timers, there's no check-ins or checkpoints per workout, it's going to be a lot of repeat. Like last year, we already saw athletes doing 1 or 2 workouts repeated in a 3-day window, which is just brutal. But like now, like that's going to be the sport. Like it's going to be, to be competitive, you're almost going to have to do that.
I don't like that aspect of it. It may not be the case, right? They may actually have the checkpoints like they did in the past, but I don't like that because when you go to semifinals, you don't get a mulligan. You don't get to go repeat the workout again. And I think the way that they had run quarterfinals before was more similar to a live event where you kind of had to get it right the first time. You could repeat, 1 or 2 of the workouts across the weekend. So I think that it does not necessarily get the people who can perform well on game day as accurately as what they've done in the past. But that's assuming that they don't do that.
I'm not disagree with you, but I'm going to agree that I think having the ability to repeat is good because quarterfinals announcements are so fast. The standards, we're still learning. There's too many opportunities to fuck it up. And I think it's unfair for the athletes to have only one shot when like you're trying to learn all this stuff and set everything up perfectly. So I agree in the fact that I would like it to be tested more like an in-person comp, but it's so hard for these athletes to like get all that stuff right and with all the things that you need.
To that point, two things there. So first, when people show up to semifinals, like they're learning the standards when they get to semifinals because they do it during the announcements. But I think what would be, Brannen was talking about solutions. A simple solution there would be for HQ to release the movements similar to what they've done for age group semifinals in the past. And they're like, here are the standards for all the movements that you're going to see. They release them a week in advance. They don't give you the workouts, but here's GHDs, here's the floor setups, here's all the stuff. You can make whatever guesses you want about what the specifics of the workout are going to be, but here's all the things you need to know for next week when you do the workouts and people have an opportunity to test it. Like that solves that problem.
I think it would make their job easier.
Yeah. You're saying that repeats are good because of mistakes, not because of like, oh, I did this workout and I could do better.
Mistakes in setup.
Yeah,
standards.
like, you look at your video and you're like, damn, my foot was outside of my hands on all of these reps. They're all no reps.
Like we had a lot of people have to redo the handstand push-up because the plate was 2 inches off the wall. It's something you don't see, like that little things like that. I feel like that's the sport, is your ability to read directions.
Yeah.
Like,
and if so, I feel like I'm failing it. I read all the directions for
we have 12 people looking at it all. We still miss things sometimes.
Taking notes. Yeah.
And like, thank God that they have time to redo it, you know?
The energy is just so high with the competitive athlete that I think, like, I remember, this is going a little off tangent, but in that Rogue thing where Chris talked about the documentary of, Travis doing all 200 double unders, the intensity and fire of somebody competitive when they're ready to go. Yeah. It almost like takes away everything that you're thinking about. He said, Travis was like, I'm ready. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready too. Let's go. I just get sucked into it and forgot everything I was doing.
That is so true. All right. But before we move to semifinals, last thing with quarterfinals, and this kind of ties in, right? Because now you only have 40 spots, which means everyone, if it's repeats or just like they're fighting tooth and nail to get that last second. But if there are more people doing the workouts and they only have so many people to review the workouts, what happens? Are there going to be no reps that kind of fall through the cracks, or someone that cheats, that just posting scores that somehow makes it in? Like, how do you handle that as CrossFit HQ?
I mean, we're going to assume that it's going to be that many more people, right? But these people still have to sign up. They still have to pay money to put their scores in. So it might affect it a little, maybe not in the magnitude of us assuming that all 25% people are going to be in there now. But the workout that comes to mind that just like shattered people was the row wall ball in the open that year, where it was just like loose reps in the open. And we just had really good athletes get tanked on that because that was a workout that like anyone could do, you know, and like, oh yeah, you finished in a class. I got 8 rounds. You sure? No, 9 rounds. I'm pretty sure it's 9 rounds, you know, like that kind of stuff. So
I think to Brandon's point, like I did the math last year for the number of man hours or woman hours that would be required.
Human
hours that would be required. It would be fewer if it was AI hours. To actually like accurately judge all the videos, like watch them at speed, not at 2x speed and all that. And it was astronomical, like the number of people that they would have had to just judge the qualifiers of every workout and watch every workout, which they claim they did. It was not possible with a realistic team that HQ could put together. And now they've increased, potentially, to Mike's point, increased the number of people and number of videos that they have to review. I think it's a mistake. I was actually just talking to one of my bubble level athletes about that before we got on this podcast. And they were genuinely concerned about the fact that, not having accurate video reviews can definitely impact their ability to qualify. And
for sure. Yeah. A strength lift or a row workout are the two big ones.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, this is a real big, this is something that we're going to have to continue to talk about, make internal decisions. But we hired judges last year that came, and some people got a significant number of no reps. Some people got no reps in their workout, still got major penalties. And when you're talking about a minor penalty now, if you're a top 40 athlete, that could like literally end your whole season. And you know that, okay, well, if these standards aren't universally applied, or we have judges that are potentially HQ judges that are watching in person saying they're good reps, and then them judging and saying they're bad reps, it almost incentivizes lack of tight standards and more looseness, because it seems unfair to athletes that are dedicating their whole lives if there's going to be ambiguity, or if there's not going to be everybody is watched, or some sort of open community sourcing viewing so that we can hold that standard. I think there's just going to be a lot of people now that potentially get cut out from semifinals unfairly as a result of things like that. So, I mean, that cutting to semifinals smaller, I feel like that's definitely one of the moves in this change that I'm just not that thrilled about. I feel like those are the people that we're trying to cultivate as the pros in the sport. And there's already not that many opportunities for them to compete. And we do need to cultivate the sport for the stars, because they drive ticket sales and people in the seats, but you don't make stars if you don't have good competition opportunities for that second up and coming class, right? If you make it really tight, where top 10 games athletes can't even make it potentially to the semifinal, that's just going to be hard to get the people in there. And then, anyways,
what are solutions to that? And forgive me, I should probably know how the process works in detail, but number one, if you don't have all videos submitted with your scores, you're cut out.
I think that would be
number
good.
two. If you don't have all scores submitted, you're completely cut out. Is that the case?
That has not been the case, but I think it should be the case.
Yeah. Like in order for your scores to be valid for quarterfinals, you have to have a video submission plus all 5 workouts in.
Yeah, you can't just do the max lift and call it.
Yeah, and you can't just put the max lift and submit just the max lift, because then the max lift is compared.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. So I think we're all in agreement that has to be the case.
And what about the crowdsourcing of the video review? How the open used to be when you would thumbs up, thumbs down? It's still in there, right? But what if that was the red flag where, okay, this person had a great lift, all these people are thumbs downing it though, they're not even in the competitive realm of the top 40, but HQ needs to look at this.
Yeah, I think that thumbs up, thumbs down thing, if it was applied in quarterfinals, could work, so long as you, as a quarterfinal athlete, were the only people that could, like, you're a certified judge in some capacity of HQ, like you're part of HQ staff, or all quarterfinals athletes could be the people that go on. Because that leaderboard is public, I think you'd want to be
thumbs down all my competitors.
Yeah,
I think there's the fatal flaw in that.
Well, if you could track it, then okay, well, this athlete is doing it. But the other thing is, if it's just open source and anybody that was in the open can just go in, like, that would be troll city. Like, people could just like, oh, I'm going to go to everybody that's part of a different camp and I'm going to thumbs down all their videos, or, I'm going to send all these videos to some.
Pretty smart.
Mike's over there taking notes.
He's going to make a troll farm.
I'm going to email my family.
Camp.
Yeah. But
this is not an MLM, but if you all create a login and go thumbs down, all these athletes.
Yeah. And ultimately, I think the fix to that is, like, the athlete voting is not the thing that creates whether or not they get a penalty. I think the athlete voting is something that could flag so that their team can make sure they watch that one.
It's just the trigger for HQ to watch.
Yeah, so like, hey, if this video gets over 300 people that says there's an invalidation in it, then, you know, somebody watches it. I don't know if that many people would watch, but
to that point, one of the biggest complaints I've had is that when HQ does apply a minor penalty or a major penalty, it's never very clear what has been penalized. And I think if they can be more transparent about that part of the process, where it's like, all right, between minutes 4:27 and 4:38, there are 3 no reps on the wall ball. Like, it just needs to be that simple. Like, they need to annotate where they happen and be able to communicate that to the athletes and communicate that to the community as well. And I think if you're talking about open sourcing the judging, I think the transparency has to be improved dramatically, and that will improve the community's acceptance of the penalties and the judging process.
And I think the penalty needs to fit the crime. Like, getting a minor, okay, we're going to apply a major penalty and you're going to get a 1-minute penalty, but really all you didn't do was fully extend your hips on 15 squats. I'm like, all right, well, that's like a total of 0.25 seconds on 10 reps. It's like 2.5 seconds is actually how much time they saved. Why are they getting a minute and a half penalty?
From HQ's perspective, none of those reps were completed, right? So for a rep to be completed, they've got to extend all the way.
But I'm saying it's not anybody that has participated in this would say, if you're going at that speed, it's not fair to just say that, like, that doesn't count if you're in an in-person competition, then just saying no rep and making them go again makes more sense. But afterwards, if you're saying, hey, you had a judge and that judge gave you the rep, but we're disagreeing with it, you can't retroactively enforce a no rep. It would be better to just say, like, hey, any rep that we feel like is short is half a second added to your time. Something that actually you'd be saving, or maybe a second, so that you disincentivize people from purposefully shorting them. Like,
I agree with you. I was just playing HQ devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Chris
Chris
wants to
has
jump
something.
in.
You said they should annotate how you get a no rep. What are they doing now? Like, what does it look like now if you do get a penalty? What do they say?
A significant number of your V-ups, for example, did not meet the standard, and there's no more context than that.
Yeah, they don't say how many. They don't tell you
what part of the movement didn't meet
part
the
of the
standard.
workout, and so forth,
or how the time was calculated.
Yes,
a lot of times it'll just be
like,
like, we gave you a minute 15 penalty. We're like, okay, well, what's that based off of? It's not always, I know sometimes it's a major penalty is like 15% or something like that, but sometimes that math didn't add up.
Yeah. Most of the time, I don't think it added up.
Yeah.
All right. So before we move on to semifinals, because you touched on this a little bit, are there other solutions then, Mike, that you would say for video review and in particular quarterfinals? Because that's really where it's going to matter, right? Like getting the right people to semifinals. You talked about making sure they had all their scores, all their videos. How would you guys actually get HQ to review that many videos though? Because it can't just be the top 40. It has to be more than that to make sure everyone's scores are correct.
I'm telling you, I did the math, and I wish that I still had those notes on my phone from
bring back sectionals.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go. Bring back in-person sectionals.
How many people was it? How many? You said 5%. Do you remember how many numbers it was when you looked at it?
Yeah, so like on the male side, there were 7,500 people that had at least one score in.
Okay, so assuming there were 7,500 people in 5 different workouts, there's just no way.
And an average workout duration of 10 minutes.
Yeah, and the videos are even longer than that if you're actually making sure that you're watching every single line adjustment or line measurement, rope measurement. I know some of those setup things are like 5 full minutes.
Right.
Like, oh,
so it's a 15-minute workout instead of a 10-minute workout because of the setup.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't really know what the solution to that is. I think really over time, which I know HQ might not like necessarily to hear me say, but I think the sport needs to go more away from online competitions or the online competition fields just need to be smaller and easier to manage and more professional. So that way, if you say, okay, well, you're paying $100 to get in this, but for that fee, every video is going to be watched when you're in this. And it's going to be like, you can't do that at scale though. Or maybe you could charge for $100 for the open, but I don't think like Jenny from the block, who's, I don't know why that came to mind, but somebody who's, I don't think somebody who's just taking a class that's like, hey, I'm signing up for the open, wants to drop $100 for a professional competition.
But do you know where they will drop $100? an in-person competition.
Yes,
and
for
one
sure.
of my, we're going to go to solutions, but I think that the shift in the sport likely will be most people just start doing more in-person. And in fact, I've already told some athletes, like, look, if you don't think you can make semifinals and you don't want to pay for quarterfinals, let's find 4, 5, 6 competitions throughout the year and do it like anybody else that plays a sport. Like we always bring up golf, but you and I have done this before. We go to these fun little local competitions and we just get to compete with other amateurs, but it's a blast. I'll pay $100 for that because I get to have fun in a sport that I love, but I'm not going to pay for Q School a $5,000 fee because I know I can't beat the pros.
Yeah.
So that may be a potential solution in the future.
We've talked about that on this podcast before, that the long-term solution is some sort of qualifying circuit, a live in-person qualifying circuit. And maybe HQ can still run the open, which is like your passport into the qualifying circuit. But once you get your golden ticket to the qualifying circuit, then you have to go accumulate a certain number of points in those live competitions, and then you go to the games.
But not even for the pro. I'm talking about like, how do we,
I'm
as a
talking
sport,
about that for masters athletes, to be honest.
for sure. Like
Because
everyone.
I'm selfish and want that to be the case for me.
I think that's awesome for those that want to make the games, but I'm talking about the person that has no interest or knows that they can't make the games. Like I can't make the PGA Tour, but I love golf. What if I did 6 competitions a year, tournaments a year, just going and paying a $100 entry fee and get to play with 50 other guys that are like around my level? That's a blast. And I think if you want CrossFit to continue to grow, that grassroots movement has to happen where there's just hundreds of local competitions that people enjoy and are well run.
I think it's already happening.
It's happening now, for sure.
I
The shift
definitely
has
think,
happened.
and I think a lot of these competitions, this is a whole nother conversation, but these competitions could be ranked tier wise in terms of like how professional or, like different grades of talent so that you can know what you're signing up for and going into. I think it's getting to that point where there's enough of them popping up.
They definitely are. All right, let's move to semifinals. We've already touched on this, and I know that you hate it, Max, since you said it like 6 times.
Yeah. Well, I like the second it came out, I got, well, do you want to finish?
Yeah. So just so for those that don't know, last year it was 60 people from each of the semifinals, other than a couple of the obscure ones, got qualifying spots, 60 males, 60 females. Now it is 40 males and 40 females. Obviously that cuts it down. It's going to be very tight to get in for the top 40. So what do you guys think about that?
Why did they do it? To make semifinals more manageable to run?
That would be my guess.
Yeah, it's going to cost them less to run a semifinal. It seems. I think the biggest travesty here is Europe. I think, I did the math last year. For someone who finished in the 90th to 100th place in Europe, they would have been top 60 in every other region in the entire world. That's just unfair. And now you've taken that same region, haven't adjust. Well, I guess we don't know if they have adjusted it. Like, I guess we don't know that for a fact.
Like there's an Eastern Europe and a Western
they
Europe.
could be splitting it, but
They listed the semis. They said the names of the semis.
So
it
it's the
hasn't
same?
changed.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So
we're assuming it's the same based on that list. Yes.
Yeah.
So now we've taken what's already the most challenging region to qualify in, and we've cut the number of qualifying spots dramatically. So now someone who finishes in 60th place, who likely would be in the top 10 in many of the other regions, they're going to be sitting out. I think that's horrible, especially for a place where, one, HQ has talked about trying to grow CrossFit. 2, the sport is flourishing in Europe right now. The fact that they're doing that, I think, it's a travesty for European athletes.
Yeah, that was definitely one of them. And the other is developing athletes. Like 2 people come to mind are Caden and David. They are coming out of the teen division, and like you come out of the teen division as a games athlete, and that jump as a young developing athlete from where you are as a games athlete as a teen to just make it to a semifinal is quite large. It was quite large at 60.
Mm-hmm.
As you start to make that tighter, those developing athletes potentially are going to need more time just to be able to get their first opportunity at a real competition. And like all of these professional sports that we see in the world, in order to cultivate stars, they have developmental processes. The NFL has the NCAA Division I football. Basketball has the actual NCAAs and the G League and a developmental league to bring in overseas people. I don't think right now CrossFit inside of the CrossFit realm has a good developmental path for people to start to become professionals. And I think that cutting it and making it more tight there just gives less opportunity for people to get better through their system. So then what it ends up doing is sending them off to these other competitions to get better. I don't necessarily like that. And I don't like that you put testing on them to make sure they get the right people there, because there's already examples from last year of people that wouldn't have made it in this system that would have performed well at the games. So I'm like, all right, well, you already have some like data to indicate that this could get messy to not properly sort your athletes if they're going to not make it through from quarters to semis, but they're potentially going to almost, podium at the games. There's obviously like, well, testing matters a lot then at the quarterfinal level to get the right people.
And I think part of that issue is that we're expecting HQ to act like a sport governing body, and really they're just an extension of a business. And I think that's part of the issue. They're not thinking about growing CrossFit as a sport from a grassroots perspective. They're thinking more about
economics.
The economics of it, which understandable. They're a business. They're not a sport governing body. But I think I tend to look at it, especially coming from competitive swimming, where the governing body was very hands-on and tried to grow the sport from a grassroots level. It's just interesting to see the different dynamics in those two things.
The plus side is that I love intense competition.
Same.
And I feel like there's going to be some people that like make it into the top 40, and for them, it's going to be like the emotion of winning the game. So there will be some very cool, but also very heartbreaking moments. I think we are going to coach a lot of bubble people that dedicate a lot of time to this that won't make it, or some people that are able to step up and go from like, hey, I was on the bubble, but I made it again. So I think it's just going to be a very emotional, volatile year. It always is, but I think the more like the games where they instituted the cuts like every workout, that brought out so much emotional heartbreak and crying and people being frustrated. And I think that is kind of what we're looking to experience this year at quarters.
Yeah, par for the course in regards to dealing with change.
Yeah, for sure.
Max, to your point, I think that is, even for a coach, it's going to be emotionally challenging because we have athletes that they spend their whole lives fighting to make semifinals and then from semifinals to the games. But now that process has been cut down. And I don't think I would mind it as much if it didn't come down to the testing body, because I think this is going to be more true than ever. From 40 to probably 80 or 100 athletes, all those athletes are very similar just based on the data we've pulled. And it's going to come down to, is it 100 chest to bars in a workout versus 100 toes to bar in a workout? Because maybe one athlete's better at one than the other. And so it's just going to be putting it in the hopper, and whatever comes out, one athlete just may be better than another. And that, to me, that's unfortunate. It'd be better if it was just like a standardized testing body.
Yeah. I mean, the arguments often we're trying to find the fittest, not the fittest group. So I get frustrated when, when that's like the fallback, because that doesn't really help the sport grow, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. Personally, that message to me was permeated more from Glassman Castro era. I haven't heard that as much. Do they still say that? Because I don't even see the fittest on earth used to be like a big tagline that was plastered all over the games, but now it's not as much. At
I
least
stand
from
corrected
what I've seen.
I mean, that's what I've heard too. So I understand that argument.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully they aren't thinking like that, because I mean, they put out the world ranking system, which obviously means that as an internal body, they're already thinking that, okay, well, if we're going to have a sport like this, we need to have a way to seed people and rank them and figure out how all of these things tie together to see who the actual best is, not just operating from the assumption that if you win the games, you are guaranteed the best. I think that age of the sport has kind of ended, because now there are so many more opportunities to compete, and you have a different winner of the games, and then right afterwards a different winner with the same person in the field at Rogue. And you're like, all right, well, like obviously tests matter a little bit, or like somebody's current. Yeah.
Cool. All right. I want to make it a little more positive. Unless do you have something else?
I just have a question. I've looked and haven't been able to find this information, but do we know how many people qualify from each semifinal? Have they announced that? I know how many total are.
They have not. It is an interesting thing though. If it was 13, was it 12 or 13 last year in the East? I can't remember.
It was different for man and women.
Okay. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But it was somewhere around 10.
So 25% of the competing population will go to the games. It's much different than, only 10 out of 60.
I wonder, I'd be curious if they review results each year and make adjustments based on that.
I think, according to what I read last year, if the rule book stays exactly the same, the ranking system that they had previously that has where you finished in the open was a certain number of points, where you finish in quarterfinals, certain number of points, where you finish in semifinals, games, and they do it on a 2-year running average. So I think last year's games will dictate this year, which will be interesting if some of the people that sat out from the games that we know are already like best of the world people are going to go into fields, but then their point and world ranking will be lower because they didn't participate. So we might get some weird shift ups where, let's say you get less spots in the East, but there's more good athletes in the East. If like, let's say Mal and Haley both go back into the field, they might have low world rankings because they didn't compete last year.
And you can't adjust that either because people move and you can't track that on a year-in-year basis.
Yeah.
Like you're not tracking registrations yet.
Yeah.
So
Anyway, go ahead.
No, that's all.
All right, cool. Let's talk about age groups and adaptive, because these, again, personally, I think were great changes, or at least there's potential for like some really good changes in the future now that other bodies are kind of governing that. So adaptive now, they have added a semifinal, which I think is really cool. So the top 20 will go into a semifinal, and then they have their own games, which again, I think is just, it's really nice that they can be highlighted on their own week or weekend. And the same thing for our age group athletes, both teens and masters athletes. Now 200 people will make semifinals, and then they'll have their own games that are run by different organizations. Do you guys think it's a net positive, a net negative? Like, you're a masters athlete. I think you should go first, Kyle.
Yeah, I think the masters.
Well,
Yeah, but he's a real masters athlete. I've never really competed in masters.
I guess that's technically true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the age group athletes, all of them, and the adaptive athletes were the winners in this.
Yes.
I think having the opportunity to have our own weekend at the games, having an appropriately sized field at the games instead of 10 athletes
Yes.
per division, especially given that, like, you know, the 35 to 40 to 44, that range just represents so much of the competitive field. And then you're like, oh, we're going to take 10.
Yeah.
You know, like that.
And it's 30 now, right?
It's 40.
40.
right
So
now.
basically everyone that did semis last year would
Be
qualify.
qualified.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus more.
Yeah, plus 10 more.
Plus another
Yeah.
10 who didn't even get to participate
Yeah.
in the semifinal. I think the dynamics of it are interesting with so it's very different, right? With a 200 athlete field in the age group semifinal, like that changes the dynamics a little bit, because when we had a 30 athlete field, so there was basically no separation. Everybody that was in the top 30 was really good. And so it doesn't allow much score movement. With 200, now you're going to get a lot of score movement, especially with like heavy lifts and the single modality.
Outliers.
The single modality test. But I think you touched on this earlier, and this is probably the most interesting thing to me, is that the individual quarterfinals workouts and the 35 to 54-year-old workouts are identical
To
the quarterfinals.
54?
To 54.
54.
So we were talking about what programming is going to happen. I think how is programming going to change? That's the most important factor.
I want to have a detailed discussion on this in a minute, so don't go into details
Okay,
yet.
I'm just going to say that
Yeah.
that is the most important factor in
I missed
us
that
being able
detail.
to predict what quarterfinals tests are going to look like, because
Agreed.
they have to be accessible for a 54-year-old and an elite,
Hold on.
23-year-old.
And a teenager.
No.
Okay.
The teenagers do not have the same workouts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's just 18 to 50. No, just this only this 40-year gap.
Yes. That's going to be the biggest factor in influencing programming. So I think
Are they all playing from the blue tees or the white tees?
I will say, of all the changes in age groups, I think I loved every single one, but that is the one that is just like absolute. That's a travesty. You talk about travesty, is testing a 53 or 54-year-old with the same workouts as a 30-year-old. And for those 54-year-olds that are watching that say that they can do all those things, I agree. And some of you guys are amazing, or some of you ladies are amazing, but there is a better way to test a 50-year-old than the 18-year-old.
Yeah. Or keep those things at the games and make sure that it's not just the top 200 or like the 100 to 200 might not have all of those skills, but they're still pretty damn fit. It's about being able to expose tests that all of them can do that still filter the best.
Yeah, I would say, to be fair, like, it's hard to know until we see the tests.
Yeah.
Like, I agree, it's going to be a challenge, but
maybe they
is
knock
it
it
just
out
going to
of
be
the
a bunch
park.
of 19.2s where it's just like
Everything's escalating?
Everything's like an
I
escalating
think you're gonna
ladder
see that,
or
which-
strength lifts. Like
I wouldn't
one
mind
RMs
that.
only.
It would be hard, and that would make quarterfinals even worse, because they'd be like, oh, you could judge and you could have people changing them out. So we'd have like a judge and one weight changer for everything. So
one more thing to add there before I pass it off to someone else to talk about age group and adaptive. But I think it's very interesting. They were very clear on HQ's site that if you're an age group athlete, your scores will also count. If you're in that 35 to 54 division, your scores will also count for individual quarterfinals. And so you could simultaneously qualify for individual semifinals if you're capable of finishing the top 40, and your age groups division for age group semifinals. And if you qualify for open semifinals, then you're also definitely qualifying for your age groups.
Yeah.
And you're very
semifinal.
impressive.
Yeah. That applies. Like Mike and I were talking about this
Small
before the
number of
podcast,
people.
like maybe 20 people.
Yeah.
But still, I think it's an interesting thing. You don't have to do like repetitive qualifiers over and over and over to try and compete in multiple divisions.
What do you think about having like a separate games for each of the like adaptive and age group and the teens?
I think it's good, especially if they can do it on separate weekends. If they schedule them all on the same weekend, then the media coverage is going to be very spread out. But I think if they're smart,
because they haven't announced the dates for next year of those. Yeah.
No, what they'll do if they're smart is that each one will serve as a ramp up to the game. So the excitement gets bigger and bigger and bigger to the CrossFit Games. No, Max, you disagree.
I don't think that's logistically. How would you have all the semifinals and then all of those and then the games?
It would be like a huge ramp of excitement up to the games versus the other way around. If they do them after the games, the hype cycle's dead and they're just going to be an afterthought, which they have been in the past. So that's what I'm expecting it to be.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it would be much cooler if they go semifinals into, adaptive, into teens, into age groups, into the games.
How many weeks between the final semi and the games? Did they announce that yet?
They haven't announced all the dates yet.
Yeah.
So we don't
I
know
think
that.
it's like somewhere in beginning, middle of June. I think logistically Legends is happening in December, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're running the competition and they're taking on more responsibility now. I would say if I were them, I'd want CrossFit support when CrossFit was done after the games and be able to have the time to prep the venue, get everything set up. It's going to be their first time to showcase that. Really, if they're taking that responsibility, they're showing that they could do it better.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the vibe is just going to be so much different. I think I think this is the best change that could have happened for the growth of age groups and masters. But I think also it's going to feel adaptive. But it's going to feel potentially like a step back when you get there because it won't be the CrossFit Games. You're not going to have all the stars there. You might not have 10,000 fans. They might not send a lot of media people. There just might be a couple media people.
No matter what, the media coverage will have to be better than this past year. They had a webcam.
Yeah.
They had like a Logitech webcam from 1996 in the corner. So no matter what, it's going to improve.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kyle has a good point.
Yeah. So a big step forward in the sport, but definitely set your expectations. I think that it's going to be a more grassroots feel type competition, even if it's professionally run and good heats. Just like, I don't think you're going to have thousands of people, even just like walking in and out of the venues or casual people that were inside the Coliseum waiting for the individuals to come in. I think it'll just be a little bit more low energy vibe.
But there wasn't that for the age groups at the games before. So I think then there's going to be a net positive. So at the games before, there are 10 people per field, per, division. And then, so you have the friends and family of each of those people, right? So now instead of 10, you multiply that by 40, like the number of people that are going to be actively watching and participating and engaged in it on site, I think will actually be increased versus the games where the people are like mass exodusing
to go watch the
individuals when the age groups are going on. I think it's going to be, this is what I said, the age groups adaptive, they are the winners out of this entire thing.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I fully agree. I think a couple other things for masters athletes or age groups in general, adaptive, they'll probably be better judging because they're only judging. It's not running back and forth to different divisions. So it's like, okay, this is my role. I think the heats will stay on time. Usually at the games have done a good job.
Treatment should be better.
They've had issues in the past where masters athletes had to stay on the field. A couple of years ago, I had two masters athletes that had to stay in between. They couldn't cool down. They couldn't change shoes. That will be changed. Treatment in general, I think when you get there, they're going to be it's going to be a better experience, which is, again, they are the winners.
Yeah, like you're the star of the show. Yep. Whereas I know like Caden, I can say this freely because he says it. He calls the team the sideshow. And that's kind of what it was before. It's like you show up to the CrossFit Games and there's this whole thing going on. And then there's a side competition. Whereas this year, I think when you show up to the Legends CrossFit Games or the CrossFit Masters Games, that's what the event is going to be. So all of their energy is about giving that group of people a good experience. So I would be pretty pumped if I was a good Masters athlete.
I am.
Awesome. Well, let's dive into the details of programming because we've had a ton of people reach out through our online program Compete asking, hey, what changes for you guys in all of your different paths? And so for those that don't know, we have what's called an intermediate path. And for the last 3 years, that path has been dedicated to getting people from the bottom 90% into the top 10%, getting them to quarterfinals. Like that's basically the goal. And now that it's the top 25%, does it change things? Our RX path is thinking about how can we get our bubble athletes into semifinals. Now it's getting a little bit tighter. So does that change things? And then in general, you guys work with a lot of high level athletes. What are you thinking when you're talking about an athlete that's a bubble athlete, an athlete that needs to make quarterfinals, or an athlete that's a games athlete? How does the season change as far as preparation goes?
Before I answer that question, you left out the Masters path. Was that on purpose? Are we just supposed to talk about individuals?
No, Masters too. They're doing the same thing. We have different options for them as well, for those that either qualify or don't qualify.
I mean, Masters will adjust once we figure out dates on the season.
Totally.
So
yeah, the program design, one thought I had when we were talking earlier, I just forgot what that thought was.
We'll blabber for a little bit. You convinced me, and then it just...
I think just real quick, and I'll let you guys kind of
story of my life, dude.
Gather your thoughts, and I'll just blab for a second so you can think about it.
Let me get my
Take
thought
some
back.
notes. So for those that are asking about our programs, our intermediate path will stay the same in that it is a developmental program, and that's not a bad thing. It's for the athlete that does not have all the skills that are regularly tested in the sport. So if you do not have muscle ups or handstand push-ups, handstand walking, we are focusing on getting you those so you can then graduate into the RX path.
I would say the shift is you will likely still see those skills. It will just happen after the 25% mark, after they're into quarterfinals. So you will still be tested on them more than likely. So if you don't have them, the path is still going. The goal of the path will still remain the same. Now, there might be some adjustments on maybe a little more engine biased for those that might struggle to get through what we're calling those preliminary tests, or maybe more emphasis on just pure 1RM strength testing, because that would make sense from a large scale testing body in quarterfinals that you could do. But we already do all those things. So when we went and looked back at it, there's not massive changes to it yet.
I also think the mindset of people in the intermediate shouldn't change. I think the goal should be to get into the top 10%.
Yes,
even if they say, oh, the standard now is here. Personally, I think if you're trying to be competitive and you're trying to get better year after year after year and go into more intense competitions and get more skills, setting your barrier or your unless you're just getting there for the first time, setting it at 75th percentile or thinking that's the goal is almost like undershooting yourself. You're better off being like, oh no, I don't just want to make it. I want to get into the top 10% of all the people that go, and just keep that goal, even though they made it a different arbitrary line this year.
Yeah. I fully agree. For those that are watching this, you can see these dials on our little soundboard here. Basically, like if these skills are all the way down at zeros, we're still trying to move those up to 10s, right? We want everyone to have every single skill first, and then you can develop all the other stuff in the sport. If you're missing muscle ups, you still have to get muscle ups. It doesn't matter if you can qualify in the top 25% or not.
Yeah. The only thing I think that changes for that group is they were prepping for the Open, doing the Open, and then pretty quickly turning around and doing quarterfinals last year. And a lot of people just did the Open and didn't qualify for quarterfinals that I think now will. So now I think it'll give you an opportunity to say, okay, now I can almost certainly practice quarterfinals. And there's going to be a 5-week training period from the end of the Open back into quarterfinals. So I think it just makes the competitive season. Last year, the Open started pretty much 3 weeks later. They were done, maybe 5 weeks if they decided to do the Open or they made it. Now it's like, hey, you're committing for 2 months. Like you're going through all the Open workouts, quick little deload, right back into training, ramp up, big weekend. And you have kind of like a 2-month long season as an intermediate.
I mean, you have an opportunity to train more for quarterfinals that way.
Yeah.
So a lot of intermediates are well above the 25% mark. So this allows them to train, put more time and emphasis on preparing for quarterfinals for more higher skills and not having to repeat their faces off.
So getting into the actual details of programming then, Kyle, you started to talk about this, and I want to touch on this. The program is going to be the same for the 18-year-old, the 22-year-old games athlete, and the 54-year-old athlete. So if we're looking at what could they realistically test, like the likelihood of them testing a 275-pound clean and burpee box jump workout that I already talked about earlier is pretty low, because if they start with a 275-pound clean, they just cut out 50% of the audience there, especially the older masters.
10 burpee tiebreak.
Right.
To that point, same thing with like the 300 feet of handstand walk as a buy-in before those wall-facing handstand push-ups. Like those are things that are just unrealistic for 50 to 54-year-old.
They're
athletes.
unrealistic, or they're just going to be like, well, whatever.
or
You're going to get time capped.
They get
You're just not going to
150
get
feet.
there.
They won't get
And
signups.
yeah. I mean, I agree with you, but
So does it, let's just assume that they are thinking about if they do that, they won't get signups. The testing body has to change. Does that change the way then that we are writing programming? Are we doing more 19.2 style ladders, more 1RM development? Because that's a super easy, you're doing a 4RM front squat again. Like everyone can do it and it doesn't matter, just kind of based on your load. Or are we writing programming like they've had it where, yeah, the entry point is 20 muscle ups to start this workout or 300 feet of handstand walk?
It's a gamble, as a coach of an individual, it's a bit of a gamble, right? You're trying to guess at what this organization that hasn't been very clear about how they're gonna do it. Like it's a bit of a gamble. I can tell you what I'm gonna do with my individual athletes, and this is probably different than how you guys would approach, coaching a large group, but I'm still going to assess their biggest weaknesses relative to the sport in the past, right? Figure out what those margins look like. And now that the gap is smaller, now that it's down to 40 athletes, we have to close those margins as tight as possible, right? So if you have always been like, let's say you're a bubble level athlete, you finished just outside or just inside of that top 60, and now it's 40. Well, guess what? All of those margins have to improve across the board. And it's like even the stuff that we had considered to be your strengths, where you'd finish, maybe top 30 in that workout. Now those have to get better too. So rather than what I'm going to do is we're going to focus on building the dials that are the weakest, right? That has to be the primary focus of your training, but those other people or those other skills, they also have to be bumped up as well. So it's going to be less focus starting probably now, right? We're in the middle of November, less focus on just like building the base and more focus on, sharpening for CrossFit, because quarterfinals are in April, like we're 4.5, 5 months away, but like we need to use every bit of that to try and close those gaps versus being able to be a little more relaxed, thinking more about keeping them healthy, thinking more about, taking a longer term approach. Like we have to start getting ready right now.
yeah, I would, if I had to guess and put a bet on it right now without more time to think, I would think more simple tests like straight CrossFit total.
We're talking about in quarterfinals.
In quarterfinals, like or a 2K row or something like that. Or there was I think it was a quarterfinals test, or maybe it was like a Dubai qualifier where it was a row into max distance handstand walk with 2 scores. I think those types of things are more likely to come out. Classic couplets, classic triplets, easier setups. If you have the whole field, all bigger field plus masters athletes, I think, and all the way up to 54, I feel like that is one of the inevitabilities about the program design, or that the higher level skills, not just like 19.2 where the weights escalate, but like last year's first open workout where ring muscle ups came out in the open, but you had to be really fit to even get there. So that way it's like, okay, well, your tie break is the Metcon up to that point, and then the 50 to 54-year-olds that can do 1 or 2, that's your separator in the workout. So I think that is what I'm thinking about right now in terms of workout construction, is either very simple tests, escalating weight tests for the heavy stuff, or escalating skills in a chipper format where you don't get to the skills until you've already done a lot of work. Because I think those are the only ways you can make the workouts the same for a 54-year-old and a professional athlete.
To me, they seem more like open tests than where quarterfinals was kind of starting to model like some in-person style tests. Like GHD rope climbs right away, like pretty high skill stuff, tons of pistols as an opening set. I just, maybe you won't see that. I think you'll just go back to the more fun, in my opinion, and complex CrossFit tests that are progressive in difficulty.
Yeah, I think it's going to look, if I had to guess, I'd say the open this year would look more like in the past when you had 5 weeks and workout number 1 and 2 were just kind of like you could walk into an LA Fitness and people could do them. That almost all the tests in the open will be those where it's just like classic and very easy and could just be put into a class very easily. Quarterfinals will look more like the old open workouts number 3, 4, and 5, where you had the escalating workouts and the more higher level skills came out. And it'll be a little bit of a throttle back from what old quarterfinals would be. I think logistically that would be the way that they would save face with the affiliates. Because if you make them super high level complexity and the masters athletes in the early 50s have to do workouts that they can't do, I think you'll lose a lot of market enthusiasm for this competition.
Okay, so you talked about that, and I think we're all in agreement. That probably is what they look like. But does that change the way that you think about programming? So for an athlete that's thinking about like, I could do muscle ups relatively well if I'm fresh, but at the end of 23.1, I couldn't do one. What should I do for my training? Like, should I be practicing muscle ups under fatigue, or is there a better way to do that so I'm good at muscle ups when they come out?
I mean, I'm just looking at more workouts as like price of admission style setup, to where you have to kind of capacity your way into them, like you got to earn your way to the heavy bars. You got to earn your way to that higher skill. So I just think making sure that there's a larger amount of those, because that kind of checks the box on a lot of other fitness qualities that we still want to hit, like a lot of strength endurance, a lot of strength under fatigue, and higher skill under fatigue, which we want to see, that allows like a large, I think we're kind of saying the same thing over and over again, but that's like maybe the one big change I would say so far is I'm definitely including more of that.
To Mike's point, training all of those skills like muscle ups or heavier barbells under fatigue, the good news about that is that even if the workouts don't show up in that format where, it's ascending skill or ascending weight, or, like there's the price of admission, like you said, even if they aren't that, you're still going to have to do the skills under fatigue, right? Even if it's rounds for time with muscle ups and GHD.
Yeah,
and
the first round feels good. And then
first round feels good. And then the fifth round feels like shit. So
Yeah.
you still have to be able to do those skills under fatigue. And so training them in a quote price of admission, I like the way that you put that style workout,
Thank you,
still
Tom.
improves them for those rounds for time, because it turns out it's a fatigue based sport.
Yeah.
For sure.
So we've been in the sport now for over a decade, and the sport has always changed. But I think I can be safe. I know I can be safe saying it for myself, but I think I can say it for the organization, is that our organization operates more on programming principles than chasing what we think CrossFit would do. And I know I'm pretty familiar right now. I've been digging back in as all of my athletes are getting ready for the season. Now they start to shift back to using the compete program and get ready for the season more often. So I've been digging in there, and I think of things like alternating EMOMs, where one EMOM is double unders and the next minute is chest to bar or toes to bar, and doing volume building progressions like that. As if you put in a different skill, I use the bad example. Let's say rowing and muscle ups, for example, you're alternating back and forth. Doing those types of volume building progressions builds your skill under fatigue, but it builds it in a way where you could accumulate more volume. So trying to just replicate the test and say, okay, well, yes, when we do Metcons, we're going to do double unders, pistols, rowing into muscle ups. But in that format, most people that aren't good at them or in the 50 to 54 might only get 2 muscle ups in that format. So it's not an adequate way to train for those types of tests. What you have to do is do intervals, fatigue-based work, burpees into your muscle ups, rest, repeat. So you accumulate more volume of practice of doing that skill while tired. So I think we won't really change our program necessarily, because we're trying to get people fit and ready for anything. So we always are getting people stronger, fitter, better skills, whatever. But we are going to critically think about what are the best components and training methods and tools that we have that set people up for success in this format before we have all the details. Little things like RX Plus path is probably the group of people that we think is closer to being preparing for semis while they're getting ready for quarters. The RX path, or maybe that's elite and RX Plus is a different one. And then RX is, okay, we're just preparing for quarterfinals now because the bubble is so tight to try to make it in. So I think those are the types of things I'm thinking about from a program construction standpoint, is how can we make predictions, but not also deviate away from what we know already works with athletes?
That's what I was getting at when I said it's a gamble to try and predict programming. So instead, that's group programming. Instead, I'm going to focus on the individual and their margins relative to where they've been in the sport, and then close those gaps. So it's like, it still comes back to basically like first principles, right? Come back to what's good training, and just make sure that you maybe start your good training a little earlier than you would have if the peak has to be a little higher.
Yeah. And in the individual side, it's easy to do that. In the group side, Brannen, Mia, Mike are accessible to, we give you all of those options, all of those skill programs. Our goal for our open prep and season prep will be to give you tools, and okay, we're going to give you all these things that we think basing on these predictions, but you have your individual needs. So here's how you would use it if you need to get stronger right now. Here's how you need to use it if you need a muscle up before quarterfinals. And I think that's going to be the primary objective of athletes following group programs, is figuring out, okay, here's what we can kind of predict. in this type of outcome, what do I need to do to prepare to get myself ready for that test?
Okay. I'm going to ask you guys one more question, and it's probably going to circle back around the same thing, but I think this is important. One of the things that we saw at Rogue is that the males and females are all getting bigger and they're just stronger. Over the last 5 years, the bias of the test has required athletes to get stronger, to have better strength endurance, and quite frankly, to be a little bit heavier. It just has not been gymnastics or like true endurance type tests to tell someone that, oh, maybe I need to lose some weight, right? Will that change now with the season changing, or we still will have a ton of strength tests in quarterfinals and semifinals and the games to where the big athletes succeed?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on the tests from the games that got the athletes to the games, which was what what percentage of the field
test at semifinals?
Test at semifinals. Yeah. So basically it's the semifinals test that selected the Rogue competitors, right? Like, and then you had 6 people from the qualifier, which you know more about the test than I do, but was it still pretty heavy strength bias? I mean, there was a heavy snatch.
The Rogue qualifier?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Heavy overhead squat.
Yep.
The long Metcon chipper was heavy with
sandbag.
50 sandbag over shoulder, or 100.
And dumbbell stepovers in between.
No, was it 100?
Wasn't it?
It was 50 sandbag to shoulder and then 50 box step.
Oh, it was 25, 50,
yeah.
25.
But still,
50 total.
a bigger athlete likely will do better than that. I'm not saying that those are bad things.
No.
My point is that if you look at the historical data, earlier on, it was very much endurance style or CrossFit endurance style tests. A lot of gymnastics, smaller athletes succeeded, especially on the female side. Now you have to be bigger both in the male and female side. And does that make you change the way you look at strength training in general?
If the programming follows the trends that we have talked about, where, you know, the open looks like the old first, 2 weeks, and then quarterfinals looks like week 3, 4, 5 of the old open, like Max alluded to, then it's going to change the type of athlete that makes it to semifinals, which will, in essence, change the size of the athletes that make it to the game. So like the answer to that is absolutely going to change the type of athlete if the programming changes that dramatically. If they just stick to the format that they have been using, then I think we'll continue to see the larger athletes continue to make it through.
With the skew now being 25%, are we going to see much stronger athletes walk into quarters, which would continuously skew the data on how powerful and strong people are in quarters? Like someone that can't hit the minimum, threshold to be top 10% on shuttle run burpee, that's not even an issue now.
But can
you have the same argument with the thruster?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking though, if the open tests are very old openy first, like double under power snatch, I think there's going to be a lot of people that are really strong that could potentially not make it into the top 75%. If you have a big, not the best games athletes or like even the Rogue athletes, they're going to get through. But I'm saying like you got an average class member that comes in that can like kind of do all the skills. Let's say they have to do muscle ups in singles or chest to bars and doubles or triples. They can do them, but not in big sets, but they're really strong. They put up a huge thruster. They would snatch pretty well. They would clean pretty well. They would deadlift pretty well. If you say, okay, well, the open tests now are 3 engine workouts and then all the strength is going to come later.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that it's a stronger, bigger athlete that's in that top 25%. It could be more engine driven athletes. And then the heavy athletes that do get through who are more well-rounded actually will get hurt more on the conditioning tests of quarterfinals because there's more people from the open that got in. So I think that the testing body that they decide this year could create a whole different shape of athlete. I think the best, like the big athletes right now who are deadlifting 400 on the girls' side and 600 on the guys' side are probably going to crush whatever comes out.
They're good enough.
They're all very good.
But I do think that you could have the bigger, stronger bubble semifinal level athletes could not be relevant this year, or they could, if they get the right skew of programs, like get all of their money tests in quarterfinals, and it could be all big people at semifinals. So it just really depends what they put out, I think.
And what level of athlete you're talking about. At the highest level of the games, I think you're going to continue to see the bigger, stronger athletes continue to be successful. But the bubble level, bigger, stronger athletes may have a harder time qualifying with this new
getting
format.
there. There might not be as many of them, or there's more like separation.
Yep.
So CrossFit said in a video that basically was like, we heard you guys or your feedback or something like that, and that's why they changed it to top 25%, and then all the other changes. Do you guys think that was actually the case, that they got feedback and they changed it, or is it what other people, like Hiller posted this video that was like 15 minutes of just him trashing CrossFit, saying it was a money grab? So what do you guys think it was?
If they were listening to feedback, they weren't listening to my feedback. I got to fill out 2 of those surveys, because I got to fill out my quarterfinal survey and I got to fill out my age group semifinals. And on both of them, I was like, stop giving me online qualifiers.
I stopped giving my feedback on them because I felt like I wasn't heard. But I don't want to be too cynical, but I feel like this was an intelligent and well orchestrated economic play. And I think that the business side of CrossFit is trying to figure out how to take their biggest monetary or their biggest revenue driver in their version of the sport and trying to make it make sense for them.
Yep.
It doesn't seem like it was actually designed at all with feedback of the affiliates or feedback with, or if it was people that are very disconnected from me and who I know in the competition realm. Because I was actually surprised when you said that many people were happy about the feedback, because I feel like since this announcement came out, I've almost been like trying to plug my ears and not listening to complaining. Like, I'm like, wow, there's so many people unhappy. And like, I'm almost waiting for generally when these things happen, there's like the wave of frustration and I'm waiting for it to like fall and dip. So that's just basically, I don't know, maybe I'm in an echo chamber, but it seems like all of the accounts that I follow in CrossFit that are not just TTT accounts, there's a lot of like, what the hell is this? Why is this happening? This is just
Is this a bigger uproar than when they removed semifinal or regionals a few years ago?
God, no, that was the biggest change of the sport that they ever made.
Yeah. I think the national champions here in 2019 was the biggest uproar that I felt.
Weren't those the same? That was the same thing.
Oh,
So
that was the same year.
That was the same year.
You qualified through the open. That was it.
I've never, I don't think we've escalated. That was the peak of the sport in 2018. And that was also the peak of the hate right after the peak of the sport, I feel like.
Yeah. So looking at it on the athlete side, I think just people are frustrated that every year something has to change. So I just was interested in your feedback on, like, as a business owner, Max, you have to make changes every year. You look at your P&L statement. You're like, okay, here are the things we got to cut. Here are the things that we're going to add. Here are the things we're going to market. But if you just like make just full blanket changes, that may impact you negatively. And that's what it seems like CrossFit has done over and over again.
Yeah. I mean, I know from myself operating the business that is almost an ancillary business to the sport that they created. It is extremely challenging to try to create systems and set people up for success and make a good experience when those things are always changing, and also hard to keep the narrative of motivation for athletes good. You're like, well, we got to deal with it. That's kind of like that's been my theme for the last 10 years. So I think if we're going to create more forward direction in the sport, I think the PFAA is already doing it in some small capacity. I think these other competitions that are popping up, the idea that we need to professionalize and have standards and say, okay, this is an intermediate athlete. This is how many things we can program in it. These are the tests that we think are balanced. Here's what pros need versus amateurs. These conversations are happening. They're not necessarily reflected in the biggest thing in our sport, which is sometimes hard to reconcile, hard to deal with. But I do think that as much as we can, as our organization with our mouthpiece, and hopefully the other ones, put pressure on that system to get more formal, structured, and similar. And I know last year, or Justin Berg was the head of the sport last year at the games. Now, so not this past year, but the one before that, they sat all the coaches down and they gave us this huge speech about how everything was changing. And we wanted to see the changes that they were making in the sport as a 3 to 5 year long plan, where we're going to take the feedback from this year and change based on what was happening. And then now he's not even there anymore. So like it's going to be hard to get continuity, I think, until there's continuity in the leadership, continuity in who's running it, who's the mouthpiece for it. So I don't have any thoughts in my head that that's going to happen in the near term, but I do think that should be something they are thinking about how that impacts the community as a whole, the organizations like ours and the athletes that are doing it, because I know a lot of people that 90% goal was like serious for them. They're like, oh, I want to make it there. And now that is just gone. So anybody in that 75th to 90 percentile who is like your avid recreational CrossFitter no longer has a goal in the season. So they'll have to kind of make that up arbitrarily.
Nothing to add.
I don't have anything to add to that. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I think we should finish it with, we are still going to do our best to prepare people for whatever their goals are. And those goals may change. And I've even, like I said earlier, I've told athletes, maybe they need to have a little bit of a paradigm shift in that maybe the goal isn't semifinals or the games, but it's, I'm going to have the most fun at these in-person competitions that I can, because at the end of the day, like even if someone makes semifinals, they make the games 20 years from now, you're going to enjoy that process. I know that's cliche, but that's true. Like the reason we got into this in the first place is to get fit, do things that we didn't think we could do, accomplish certain goals. And you could still do that outside of it just being a CrossFit thing. And so even if they make mistake after mistake, year after year, we're going to be here. We can be a solid foundation for everyone and have good programming.
I'm still on my journey to win a big check. I don't care if it's $15. I
will give you one.
Yeah, we should have one for Wick. Like
come on over, guys. You
Brandy
guys
and
can
I qualified for Fittest of the Coast Masters 35-39 co-ed team. And I was like, email them and see if they have big checks.
Dude,
if they do, I'm in.
I got my first big check at Crash, and it is hanging up. You can't walk into my house without walking underneath the big check. You have to see it.
I got to sign up for comps.
Max and I got to go over and play golf with a guy that's was on the PGA Tour, and we got to see a check from one of the wins that he had, and that was cool. It was a lot more than
it's more than what you get in CrossFit.
Travis,
you know what? My check was bigger.
We were in Madrid, and I was talking to Travis about it, and he handed me his, and I was like, "This isn't the same. I need to earn this." He's like, "I don't want it. That's your name on it. Someone scratch my name on it."
Yeah, I wanted to conclude or just really reiterate what Brannen said. We put these podcasts out to give perspective on the long term of the sport. But when it comes down to it and we're in it, it's going to be pretty much the same type of experience that I think everybody's always got. You're going to have trained really hard for it. We're going to have had a mindful approach in terms of how do you get as good as you possibly can for that. There's going to be opportunities in the workouts to hit PRs and set targets and set micro goals and repeat workouts and high five with your friends and fail and succeed and all of those things that don't change. And that's the reason why a decade later, we're still fired up about doing it, while on one hand complaining about things that we want to get better. So I think just realize, like, try to accept and reconcile all of the people that have been sending me things that they're upset about. You have this period of time now. You got a couple months to get over all of the change and grieve the loss of what you expected it to be, and now start making peace with what it is and making the best of that. And that'll be kind of our mission now that we have a little bit more clarity and setting, plans for everybody that's in our program and setting the masters up for success and setting those bubble level athletes up for success. So I'll try to keep ending on a positive note and just reiterate, thank Brannen for reminding me not to be too complainy.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah. All right, guys, stick around for a Would You Rather session.